Okay, well, hello, everyone. Welcome to the Evidence-Based Project Management Practice Roundtable. My name is Jacques Alexis, and I'll be the facilitator of today's conversation. This roundtable is a collaboration between Northeastern University and the PMI Mass Bay chapter. A big shout out to the chapter's members, Sophie and Greg, among others, who have been supporting this forum. The topic today is managing the human element in Project Change. And our guest speaker, Dr. J. Spitulnik, will lead the conversation on change management. Now, Dr. Spitulnik does not need introductions, but the way we do this usually is to give you a short information about the speaker's bio. Jay has been managing and teaching in the corporate and academic communities for more than 35 years. Since 2003, his focus has been on healthcare. Currently, he directs a health informatics graduate program at Northeastern University. He also teaches a project management course that is designed for full-time project managers, for those whose project management assignments will only be part of their work, and for anyone who'll be managing change initiative in any type of organization. Jay holds a bachelor's degree and master's from Boston University and a PhD in organizational psychology from Walden University. He is certified as a Green Belt by American Society for Quality and as a certified performance technologist by the International Society for Performance Improvement. He currently serves on the board of directors of the Society for Participatory Medicine and the New England Association for Healthcare Quality. Dr. Spitulnik, it's such a great pleasure to have you, and welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and it is definitely a pleasure to be here. I see that a lot of my current and former students have joined us, so it's good to see you here. The ones who are currently my students in project management are going to see something very similar to this later in the semester. Just to start off with today, just to make sure that everybody knows where we're going and what we're going to be doing this afternoon, these are the learning objectives. When we finish this, you're going to be able to know about and do, you're going to be able to explain why change management is necessary. You're going to be able to define the relationships between change management and project management. We're going to be looking at, and you're going to be able to explore and apply various models of change and how they support effective project training. And you're going to be able to describe the risks of what happens if you do not effectively manage the human element of change. So let's start by looking at the traditional concept of change and practices. Anything in the project management body of knowledge, the PMBOK, that deals with change addresses the triple constraints of cost, schedule, and scope. It's possible, but not likely, that you could finish a project without ever having changes in any of these constraints. The PMBOK and other guidance on how to manage change does a great job in describing how to control and managing these changes. But there's another major type of change that isn't explicitly addressed in most of the common guidance on managing projects. That's what we're here to talk about today. So let's take a look at what constitutes that type of change. To begin with, let's look at a common definition of a project. The phrase in red and italics is important because it tells us that there's something at the end of the project that either didn't exist before the project, or if it did exist, is different from the way it was before the project. That means that there's a type of change that doesn't necessarily fall within the scope of changes in the triple constraints. Given the definition of a project, we know that we're moving from something that exists to something that's new. The project is the process that occurs between where we are now and where we want to be. So what that means is that all projects are change events. If we didn't want something that's different from what we have now, we wouldn't need a project. So what that means to us then is that project management equals change management. If we're trying to make something change, when we're managing that, we're exercising change management. So finally, what that means is that as a project manager, you're also a change manager. So that's why we're here today. So this takes us back to looking at the triple constraints. The management of scope, cost, and schedule, and the changes to them can be considered the technical change. The human side of change constitutes all of the ways the new end result affects all of the stakeholders involved with the change. Project success doesn't just mean meeting the scope, cost, and schedule requirements of the project. It also means that the change is successfully implemented by the people and the organization. And that's where the human side of change comes into play. A frequent phenomenon that we see is that when managers do plan for the people side of change, they put everyone in the same bucket. That doesn't work. Not everyone in the organization will react to the change in the same way. Implementation of any new technology is a good example of this. Those of you here in your 20s and 30s were born with laptops, tablets, and smartphones in your hand. So you think about that for the older people in the audience. They're not as familiar from birth with the new technology that you are. This doesn't mean that you can't train people to use the new technology, only that they have to be approached differently. So you need to have you need to have targeted buy-in campaigns. I've only got two groups here, but there can be tons of different groups that need to be addressed to make sure that the way that we're managing the change is going to fit everybody who's involved with the change, all the stakeholders. So with that in mind, let's take a look at a definition of project management. As was the case with the definition of project, I've highlighted a phrase here that is particularly important for managing the human element of change. In order to ensure that everyone in the organization is going to respond and accept the change appropriately, we need to ensure that groups are involved to make sure we address their needs in planning for and managing the change. And I'll be talking about that a little bit more as we go along. So let's put this in the perspective of PMBOK guidance. Technical change management is mostly integrated with the quality, scope, time, and cost management elements of the project management knowledge areas. These are explicit in the PMBOK knowledge areas, but the human element of change isn't. Some people will tell you that communication and stakeholder management address this, but that isn't really completely the case. So it's always been my contention that we need a new explicit knowledge area to specifically address the human elements of change management. And I've actually, in the last 2 or 3 editions of the PMBOK guide, I've actually commented that we need to add a knowledge area of change management. Maybe someday that'll happen. So there's an interesting equation that helps explain why this is important. What this means is that for change to be successful, the product of current dissatisfaction with the current state, the change's desirability, and its practicality have to be greater than the cost of the change. Simple mathematics tells us that if any of those 3 factors, A, B, or D, are 0, the product will be 0. So in managing the human element of change, we have to be able to create an environment for the change where each of the factors are able to produce a product that is greater than the cost of changing. So before going into some ways to do this, let's look at some theories of how to affect organizational change. Here are 3 of them that can guide you in your process of planning for and managing your change. I'll go through each of them to give you an idea of how they help you in your change planning process. Most processes for planning and managing organizational change relate to theories that Kurt Lewin, an organizational psychologist, first put forth in the late 1940s. Based on extensive research, Lewin concluded that organizational changes have three phases. The first phase is what he called unfreezing, and this is when you, the project manager, will be looking for the compelling arguments to turn the product of A times B times D into something that is greater than the cost of the change. When an organization has become unfrozen, that's when they're ready to begin acceptance of the change. The moving step is what happens when you're actually making the changes and people are learning the new things they have to learn in order to do their jobs differently. Refreezing occurs when the new technology is in place and the end users are effectively and appropriately applying the outcomes of your project. Although they may not use the terminology of unfreezing, moving, and refreezing, most people who talk about behaviors associated with managing change are doing something that resembles these three steps. More recently, John Kotter has suggested an 8-step process for leading successful change. If you look at this process, you can see that the steps of unfreezing, moving, and refreezing are embedded in Kotter's process steps. For example, the first 4 steps in this process could all be considered elements of unfreezing. That is, beginning to identify the compelling reasons to support this change. Steps 5, 6, and 7 could all be considered elements of moving. You're doing the things that are necessary to create the change and to prepare the individuals and the organizations to implement that change. In step 8, you're refreezing by making the new technology an integral part of the new way of doing business in the organization. Bill Bridges' approaches to managing organizational transition is based on the understanding that there are emotions involved with changes. So we start with the ending phase. That is, we need to identify who's losing what. And we need to figure out ways to repeat information about what is changing. And what Bridges tells you is that you need to mark the endings with events. There are a lot of different things that people do. But when you have an actual event that's going on that says, what we're doing now is going to be different from what we've ever done in the past, that's the endings. In the neutral zone, people are starting to feel disoriented. Motivation can fall and anxiety can start to rise. Consensus can break down, but this is the phase where there can also be a lot of creativity. It's the time when resistance is ending and exploration is beginning. And I'll show you a little bit more later on with the model that we're going to be working with as to what that means. Don't ignore what's going on in the neutral zone. Treat it as part of the process. What happens in this phase is that a lot of times when you put together task forces and project teams, that's an important element of helping to get you through the neutral zone. When you get to the new beginning, which is where you're basically starting to refreeze, there are 4 key elements that are needed to help you make the change. First, you have to have a clear understanding that's developed and established throughout the organization of the of the purpose of the change. Why is A times B times D greater than the cost of the change? You need to have a good picture of how the organization is going to look and feel that's different from the way it was before. You need to have a step-by-step plan to get there, and we all know about that with our project plans. And you need to make sure that everybody understands the part that they play in the outcome. And the new beginning has been successful when you can demonstrate large-scale commitment to the plan throughout the organization. So with this in mind, let's take a look at the first change planning tool that we can work with, and you'll understand from this why I was talking about resistance and exploration. We know that changes go through 4 phases, and we need to figure out how to move people through them. There are a couple of things to keep in mind here. First, this is a natural cycle. It's normal for people to be in denial at the beginning and to resist the change. One of the biggest problems that we have in managing projects is that frequently, if we treat that normal resistant reaction as negative behavior, the resistors might resist passively, and we don't know that they're doing it. We need to understand and plan for ways to positively deal with natural resistance. One project that I've worked on at the health system I used to work at involved a major change into the way nursing accreditation was going to have to take place, and we knew that we knew that there were going to be certain organizations within the nursing organizations that were going to be highly resistant to this. So what we did was hold focus groups so that we could identify more specifically why they were going to be resisting, what the reasons were going to be behind their resistance. But something else that's going to happen is that we're going to identify who the leaders are going to be in the resistance. What we did in this organization was we found the departments that were going to be the most resistant, and we found 2 very vocal thought leaders in those departments who were going to be strongly resistant. We put those 2 people on the project team, and the end result of this was that not only did they become 2 of the biggest proponents and 2 of our biggest spokespersons for the change. When I did some papers on this change throughout the following year, these 2 people both asked me if they could come with me to help present the papers. So that's just one way. Get focus groups or some other way to identify specifically which parts of the organization are going to be the strongest resistors, what their causes for resistance are going to be, and then how is it we're going to get these people involved. The second thing to keep in mind is that when the project starts, the project's clients, the sponsors, and the project manager are probably already at the commitment phase. This leads to what I call the trapeze effect. The clients and sponsors think that other stakeholders will just jump on a trapeze and swing over to commitment. As the project manager, you need to be able to convince them that it's necessary to help manage the others in the organization through to exploration and commitment. And that's basically what I had to do with this project that I was just talking about. I had to work with the chief nursing officer in the hospital, as well as the chief executive officer in the hospital, to help them understand why it was that people were going to be resisting. They didn't necessarily understand it thoroughly before all the focus groups, but once they saw the results of the focus groups, they said, okay, we understand, we need to help walk them through resistance. So understanding that this is something that's natural and that can be worked through. There are assessment tools that you can use to find out where the organization is, and you usually are going to find that when you do this initially, if you do it use an assessment tool, that a large part of the potential audience and ongoing stakeholders for the change are going to be people who are currently in the denial and the resistance phase. So that's one tool. This is a second one that I use, and this happen. What happens typically when we're planning for change? We look at the individual changes, but not the organizational changes. So what happens when we're training somebody on a new set of knowledge, skills, abilities, developing new attitudes? and we put them right back into an organizational environment that is not adapted to support the new capabilities. What happens when we put people with new skills into a non-supporting environment, they end up right back at their starting point, and the organization never reaches the desired end state. Those of you who are involved with IT projects know that there's a very large percentage of IT projects that never reach the desired goal of the project. And one of the reasons that I have found very strongly is because what's happened is that the only thing in the organizational capabilities that people have looked at is developing new tools, but they haven't looked at all the elements of the structure of the organizational culture, the organizational processes, and the leadership to determine what also needs to change in the organizational capabilities. A good example of this is a project I worked on as a consultant with an organization that develops and markets assessment tools. Up to a certain point in time, their products were all standard off-the-shelf products. But at one point, they decided they wanted to start developing and selling customized products for their customers. Now, the way that this worked in the past had been, you'd have a group of people who developed the off-the-shelf product, and then they had a sales team that took it over. The people who were doing all the product development and production were people who were strictly salaried people. The salespeople were people who were on salary plus commission. So what we were asked to do was to come in and train the people as groups on how to do this customized development and sell it. And it was going to be completely voluntary. Anytime a potential opportunity for a customized product came into place, the people had an opportunity to volunteer to be on the team working on this. Now, because of the fact that we were familiar with this model, we told the client that there was a danger that this was not going to work because there were going to be other things happening within the organization. We said the fact that the fact that the salespeople were going to be rewarded for extra for this with commissions, and the others weren't. So they said, no. This is one of those things. They were the leadership of the organization felt that everybody was going to be at the commitment phase. So we did because of the fact that they were a good client of ours. We said, okay, we'll do the training. 6 months later, we got a call and said, you got to come back and do that training for us again. It didn't work. Nobody's going to be Nobody's been volunteering to be on these teams. So given the fact that this was an organization that produces assessment tools, we asked them, would you allow us to do an assessment to see if we could find out why they are not volunteering to be on the teams? We had a good idea of why that was going to be. And like I said, because they're an organization that produces assessment tools, they let us do an assessment. And what do you think we found? Well, what we found was that people who were not in sales were not volunteering to be on the team because they knew the salespeople were going to get rewarded for success, and they weren't. So we were able to help them redesign their compensation process so that people who were working on the teams to design, develop, and sell these customized products then were starting to be commissioned as well. And all of a sudden, the desirability to participate in this picked up, and they had a strong example from it. The key thing to point out here is that when you are looking at a change, you need to look at the organizational capabilities as well as the individual capabilities. It may be that you're not going to have to change anything other than the tools, and that's going to support getting to the desired end state. But my experience has been that usually something needs to change in some of these other elements of organizational capabilities as well. So you need to factor those into your project plans to say, how am I going to change these organizational capabilities? What am I going to do? Now, there's another model that a lot of people work with from a company called ProSci, called the ADKAR model. And those of you who are PMI members should make note of this, because I've been hearing from some people in PMI that they're starting to team with ProSci. They actually provide a relatively expensive model to become a change agent, and PMI is going to be working with them. But what they have is what's called the ADKAR model, and the ADKAR model is an acronym for the following. First is you need awareness of the change. What you need to do is announce the change to employees well ahead of time and explain your reasoning behind the change, including current pain points and potential return on investment of the new solution. And you need to give employees an opportunity to ask questions and make suggestions. And that's actually what we were doing with the example that I gave you before about what we did, changing the nursing practices in one of our hospitals. We were giving the nurses an opportunity to ask questions and to make suggestions. And we were also using that as a means of recruiting some people who could help us with actually implementing the project. So another piece that was going on there, you need is the desire to participate and support the change. And what you're doing here is you're gauging employees' reactions to the change, and you're identifying champions. You're identifying if employees are resistant or indifferent, you're addressing their concerns or showing them how the change benefits them, is going to benefit them personally. So what you're doing here is taking the first steps of helping people transition from the resistance phase to the exploration phase. Next is you need to help with knowledge of how to change. So you need to provide training or coaching to show what employees need to do after the change takes place. You need to identify and address skill gaps. What is it that people don't know now that they're going to need to know and be able to do after the change takes place? And you need to provide other resources, such as process flowcharts that employees can reference later on. So this links with what I was talking about before, looking at the organizational capabilities. If you have major changes in your processes, then you need to be able to show people what the differences are between the processes. You need to have the ability to implement the desired skills and behaviors. So one of the things that happens in a lot of cases is that people schedule practice runs before the change is fully implemented. And then what you're going to be doing is monitoring the performance immediately following the change and providing constructive feedback. And in all of this, what you need to do is set reasonable goals and metrics at the start and adjust the processes as necessary. Many of you are probably very experienced in creating project charters, and you know that one of the things that you're doing early on with your project charters, before you go into any more detailed planning of the project, is setting up what the goals and metrics are for this project, so you can use them to help make sure you're developing the new abilities, but also that you have the capability to measure whether the new things are being done when the project is completed. Finally, you need to reinforce it. You know, we know from the definition of the project that the project has an end date. So you need to build into the project plan something that's going to be happening after the project is completed. You need to be able to monitor the change over time to ensure that it fulfills your desired outcomes. And part of this, one of the big pieces of this, is that your project plan and everything that you're doing in managing change should include positive feedback, rewards, and recognition that encourage the employees to keep following the new process. So one of the things that this does, that the ProSci model does, once again, is that it can take you a step back to Kurt Lewin's model of unfreezing, moving, and then refreezing. Essentially, that's what the ADKAR model is doing, is pointing you out some ways that you can make all of this happen. So what does all of this mean then in terms of managing change? What are the steps that we need to take? Well, I'll give you a second to read this before I say anything more. Taken together, what all of these mean is that what your project plans and your change management plans within the project plans have got to tell you these 6 things. And what it boils down to is you got to figure out where you want to go. You got to figure out where you are now. You got to figure out what's going to block you from getting there and how you're going to overcome those barriers when you get there. You got to have all the steps in the project, your work breakdown structure, your CPM networks, all of these things that go into it to help you define how you're going to get where you want to go. And then the metrics that we're talking about, how is it that you're going to know that you've met your goal? And how is it that you're then going to know that the process has ended? Remember, I've been saying this all along. Well, I started at the very beginning, the definition of project. We know that a project has to have an end state. One of the things that's interesting about projects that are not managed appropriately is that they never end. And how many of you are in organizations where you have standing committees where you have absolutely no idea why that standing committee exists? And one of the things that if you take a look at that, you'll discover that a lot of cases you have standing committees in organizations that started off as projects, and they were projects that never ended. And this is another thing that happened within the healthcare organization I worked at before I came to Northeastern. One of the senior level executives in the organization saw me do a presentation like this and said, you know, we've got a whole bunch of standing committees. Can you take a look at them and see if any of them fit what you're talking about here? And, you know, these were standing committees that had a lot of highly paid professionals that were meeting on a monthly or bi-monthly basis or whatever. And it had gotten to the point where nobody could quite figure out why they were there. What I did was I took a look for this executive at 25 standing committees that reported to him or reported to people who reported to him. And believe it or not, what I discovered was of these 25 committees is either 18 or 19 of them were projects that never ended. And we were able to justify eliminating, I think it was 18 of these committees, because of the fact that when they had managed the project, they never had a way to end the project. So in some cases, these were committees that had been in existence for as much as 10 years. And so there was a project that had essentially been going on for 10 years without ending. So one of the things that we learned you need to learn how to do is know how you're going to end the project. So, you know, remember when I was talking about Bridges' approach, I said what he has is a process. What he talks about is ending what was happening before. You also have to have something that's formally in place to end the whole process for the project that you're on. One of the things that I want to point out is what happens if you don't do this? What is the organizational risk if change is poorly managed? And the reason that I bring this up is that if you analyze why a lot of projects don't meet their desired outcome, is that you have one of two things happening. You've got a person who understands change management, but doesn't understand project management, or you have a project manager who does not understand change management. And so this is what can happen. I'll give you a second to read this list of things. There are three that are most immediate and evident, and those are the ones that I've italicized and bolded. So one of the things that I talked about in the earlier models, particularly the four-step denial, resistance, exploration, and commitment model, is the fact that if it's not treated properly, resistance can become passive. And that's what happens when you get the resistance that's both active and passive, is that in a lot of cases, you're going to get the productivity plunges that I'm talking about here. People are going to stop doing the work as well as they were doing it. That's one very strong impact on the customers. But what happens if people are in an environment where they're not at all satisfied with the change that has taken place? They are still in deep resistance to the change that can take place. The productivity can be accompanied by the decline in the quality of work. But think about this. In any organization, the best people are the ones who will be sought by your competitors. So if the change is poorly managed, you risk losing your best people because they won't have a problem finding work someplace else. These other things are all things that can happen as a result of this, but the productivity plunge, the loss of valued employees, and the decline in quality of work are things that are really major, because every one of these three can have a major impact on any of the other elements, any of the other things any of the other risks if the change is poorly managed. I'm sure that there are a lot of others, but these are the ones over my experience that I've dealt with most frequently, and these are the ones that are most important. So I want to end my presentation with an overall observation about change, and that is that the only people who like change are wet babies, and often even they whine through the whole process. But the thing is, let's keep this in mind. Even if they're whining through the whole process, it's a natural thing for them to do, just as the denial and the resistance are natural things for people to do when they're facing change. So what we need to do as we're planning our projects is plan how we're going to address the fact that there's going to be a negative reaction starting off, that there's more than just the individual things that have to change, and that we have to be able to walk through all of this. So with that in mind, this is who I am. If you've got any questions about all of this that we don't answer throughout the course, we've got a whole bunch of time left over now between now and noon for you to ask questions about anything that I've covered here today. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And Jacques, how do you want to do this? Do you want people to put their questions in the chat, or do you want them to raise their hands?
Yes, thank you very much. This is a fantastic presentations, great content here, things we can actually use at work, very practical as well, and grounded in theory. So that's fantastic. Now the floor is open for questions. If you have any questions, you can raise a hand and speak out. We'd like this to be as interactive as possible. This is and I'm so happy we have 19 minutes left. Let me check the chat. We can actually look at the chat. Okay, well, Townsend, great session. Thank you. That's classic. Anyone, any questions, someone, comments? It doesn't have to be questions, can be comments.
I have one question, if I may.
Go ahead,
Tom, please.
Yes. Hi, Jay, great session. Really very helpful. One question that I had was on your second model, when you talk about resistance and how do we deal with this? So I really like when you mention, okay, involving these folks, especially if they're leaders who are resisting large organizational changes, looping them in the project is helpful. What other additional strategies would you suggest if that doesn't work? Is there any structured approach?
There is actually one of the things that is an element in the PMBOK knowledge areas is communication. And one of the things that you need to do in your communication planning is address how you're going to do this. And what I like to say is that what you need to be able to do is that you've got the right messages communicated by the right people at the right time, and in order to make this happen. And along with that, there's an old maxim that says that if your change is going to be effective, you need to be able to communicate 3 times in 3 different ways. So part of this goes along with what you've been doing, to communicate, to talk to people before you start all of this. focus groups are one thing, but one of the ways that project managers need to be able to function is that if you can't do the focus groups, you need to get around and talk to key people. And when I say talk to key people, I don't mean telling them what to do. This goes along there. Any of you who've ever worked in sales know that in sales training, what you're told is that a good salesperson talks 15 to 20% of the time and listens 80 to 85% of the time. So what you need to be able to do is to talk to all the people who are going to be involved with it, and you talk to them by asking questions about what's happening, about what they see happening with this, why they think it won't work, what problems they have with that, and then as much as possible, getting them involved as much as you can in the planning. One of the things that your communication plan should include is how are you going to be reporting on what's going on. So it may be that your communication plan for reporting tells you this is what I need to tell these people based on knowing, what it is that's of importance to them, what it is that they're concerned about. You make sure you're continuously communicating with them about how you're addressing that.
Absolutely. This is fantastic. And that's a great question, Tom. One thing we also say in organizations is that people don't really resist change. What they resist is loss. You have to understand what do they lose from implementing the change. And if you understand what they lose, some people that will require, personal adjustment. You need to understand from their point of view. And if you can, reassure people that, for example, if you're changing, let's say, an ERP system, an enterprise resource planning system within an organization, and some people who are experts in the current system, they certainly not going to like it because they feel they might not be needed after implementations of the new system. What if you guarantee them training and tell them, you're going to be very good at this, nothing going to change for you. And it's really understanding people's point of view from why they wouldn't like that change to be implemented.
And that's a great point, Jacques. What happens is a lot of times when they're in the denial phase, that's what, they're denying that loss, and then when they realize that it's going to happen, then they begin resisting the loss. So you have to figure out how it is that you can communicate to them in a way, that they're going to recognize. You go back to the equation, the A times B times D. How is all of that going to end up being greater than the cost of the change? And the loss is considered part of that cost.
Absolutely. Do we have any other questions?
There's a question in the chat regarding the last slide reference, how to end the process or project. How can you define this besides releasing the resources or team and objectives are met? Well, one of the ways that I've always done this is to have some kind of a formal project closeout event. Just like Bridges talks about having a formal event to end what you're moving away from. Have some kind of a formal event. It can be a closeout meeting. It can be a party. Very early in my career, my project management involved managing refueling outages at nuclear power stations. And what my closeout event was always an end of outage party to indicate, not only were we back online and producing power again, but we were through with all the things that we're going through for this massive refueling outage project. So what it boils down to is that what you need to do is to make it something actually observable. I didn't see who asked that question, but whoever it is, did that answer your question?
I believe it was questions directly to you from the chat, because I don't see it from my end.
Okay.
Beth, did you want to speak or have a question?
Sure, if you got a minute. So first of all, I want to say I'm shocked at your example of having 18 committees just kind of going on for no good business purpose, because where I have lived my career, what happens is that people just stop showing up, right? They find other things, and you find your meeting gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And that's a sign to me always that this thing needs to come to an end, or we need to rethink it. But that's what I see happen in the real world. The other thing I want to say about change and helping motivate people to make change is I find I do really well if I can explain to people the business purpose, right? We need to do X because of Y. And sometimes in that conversation of why we're trying to get this thing done, I will find those barriers to change, the resistance, but sometimes I will also find that the goal needs to be tweaked. Right. But being able to take, because especially engineers, they will hear a goal and they will go, yes, we're going to go, but that might not be the right goal. The right goal might be just a little different. Yeah. So what's the business purpose?
You're absolutely right about the committees. People just stop coming, and that's one of the reasons that the senior executive said to me, I think that maybe we got that problem. And that's why he had me look at the committees to see which of them really did fall into that category.
Yeah, you need project managers who can say no.
Yeah.
I know for myself, what I've always done is if I'm running meetings, I make sure they run out at the end of the calendar year.
Yeah.
And that gives me a point to force myself to stop and take a look and say, do these need to continue? Right.
Well, a lot of what was happening in that organization was kind of indirectly related to a lot of what I've been talking about. It just happened that organization had a chief executive who, because of a lot of bad project managers in his previous organization, really had a negative attitude toward project management. And so one of the things that I and my colleagues had to do was to convince him that no, we could do it right.
That makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
But thank you. This has been a good session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Perfect. And one thing you said, Jay, at the very beginning of your presentation is that project management is about change. This is very true. And when people are working in project, or when they try to implement anything, in organizations. And one of the things you talk about, or understanding who the stakeholders are and what are the expectations. One of the, when we take a look at the project management framework from the PMI perspective, for example, one of the first things they ask you to do is to know who your stakeholders are and try to understand their expectations. And managing expectations, again, communication will play a very important role in implementation success. So that's what project managers must keep in mind.
Yeah, and for those of you who have been around a bit longer, you know that before the 5th edition of the PMBOK guide, stakeholder management was not a knowledge area. That there were only 9 knowledge areas in the original 4 editions of the PMBOK guide. Stakeholder management, for exactly the reasons that Jacques is talking about, was added in the 5th edition.
Yes, absolutely. Let's take a look at the chart again. Do we have anything in the chart? It looks like, yeah. Any advice to drive change in organizations where people are frustrated with past failures from similar initiative and exhausted? How?
Well, this is where a project manager's expertise as a process improvement people, as a process improvement comes into play. Because what you need to be able to do is to take a look at the past initiatives, the past projects, and ask the question, why were there failures? What was it that went wrong? One of the things that the students who are in the people who are in this roundtable, who have been my students, can tell you is that one of the things that I always recommend is that you look at things that are going on in your project where you may not have the expertise to do this. And this is one of the things that I would say, as somebody who's spent a lot of my career in the world of organization development, is that this might be a time where you need to get some help the organizational development or the organizational behavior people in the organization and just say, what is it that I can do to assess this, and what is it that I need to do to make it different in the organization, so that a process that they have got very real reasons for resisting, that they can understand what I can help them understand what we can do to make it work.
Fantastic. I was making sure that I didn't miss any of those questions here. Anyone else? We do have another 7 minutes left.
Yes, this is Sanjana. Hi, Jay. I have the same question where you talked about converting resistors to conductors. So I wanted to know, you gave an example of nursing department, how you converted them as your horsepowers, to spread the word for you. So did they had any valid reasons for change? I want to know. And did they see that the change management was not planned properly? And if yes, did you come back and corrected that process which incorporated their valid reasons, whatever they might be? Because I'm going through the same thing wherein we are trying to do something in our organization, but we are not getting hang of the things. We are trying this or that, but I clearly see this as this is not going in the right direction. Like you said a minute ago, as a student, I may not be the correct person. I may not have all the knowledge, but I definitely see there is a big gap. I see the gap analysis is not done properly. This is just on the fly, things are happening. So I want to know, I see resistance is not just like that. There have to be valid reasons. So how can those valid reasons be converted in our change management process, so that they can help the team, the organization, the individual?
Well, there are a couple of things. That's a great question, and there are a couple of things that that you have to look at. And the first is going back to that equation to make sure that your product is greater than the cost of changing. And a lot of the times the resistance is because one of those three things: the current satisfaction. There's no current dissatisfaction with the way it currently exists. There's no desirability of the change, and it's not it's not practical. So if any one of those things are at zero, then what you need to be doing is starting to ask, do we really need to make this change? And that's something that's very difficult. You need to be able to ask whether you really need to make the change. But then, if you do really need to make it, in the case that I was talking about with the nursing organization, it's not because they were doing anything wrong, but because one of their accrediting organizations had added a new requirement. And if they were going to get accredited, they had to meet that requirement. So what we needed to be able to do was to figure out the arguments to get to the right point where we could get people to understand why we had to do what we were doing. And that's why having those people who were strong resistors on the team was because over time they began to understand why the product was greater than the cost of changing, and why it became necessary. But yeah, you just have to make sure that what you have to be able to, one of the things that you have to have in your organization is enough of an understanding to be able to step back and say, you know what, this is not going to work. Yes. Let's not do it. Let's not do it.
I have the same.
Sanjana, you know how to get a hold of me, and if you want to talk about this after this session, I'd be happy to talk to you. And that goes with all of you, by the way.
Yeah. No, I have the same opinion. We don't need that change, but then I'm a newbie. I cannot, senior management, I cannot tell them, no, this is wrong, but I see that that's going to fail.
Yeah. And implementing change is obviously a process. What we encourage people to do is experimenting. So always try things on a small scale, like in a small unit or division, before you deploy anything on a large scale, because you want to understand how people, what are the results, collect data, get feedback. It's an entire process. So if you experiment with something at a small scale and it does not work, obviously it's not going to work on a large scale. So that's one thing also to keep in mind. It's a process.
Totally agree.
Just like innovation. In project management, the way we deal with complexity in change is we tell people, do prototyping. Prototyping is a good way to understand how this works and how are people interacting with it. And once you understand that, then you go and try to implement it or try to develop on a large scale.
Yeah, as someone who's an organizational psychologist, I can never stress enough that you need to figure out which people you need to talk to. And once again, the talking needs to be 80 to 85% listening, not telling, so that you can hear what is going on in people's minds and figure out what it is that you need to do to get them on the right side of the argument.
Fantastic. Thank you all for attending this roundtable. It's always a pleasure to see you. And with many thank yous to our speaker, Dr. Jay Spitulnik, for fantastic sessions. We certainly would like to welcome you back, sometimes this year, to talk more about your expertise and experience. We appreciate you here.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jay, you want to have a you want to talk further, or I'll hang up?
I can certainly leave because Jay, you are co-host. I can leave without any problem.
Okay.
I'm going to stop recording. Let's see, where is this recording button? Hold on.
Should be on the bottom.
Yes, I just need to find it.